there's 3 speakers at this event that are using no slides whatsoever. One of them is Mr. Ari Meisel. He was quoted by Greatest as the most productive man alive. He actually was an attendee at last year's Mastermind Talks event, and this is how I pick some of our speakers as well. If a roundtable goes exceptionally well and it resonates with a lot of people, it's a good indication it's going to resonate with a lot of people at the event itself. So I invited Ari to come and speak about his methods. I actually invited him, after I heard his roundtable went so well at last year's Mastermind Talks event, I invited him to do a little 1-hour workshop at one of our Mastermind Talks retreats. And it was phenomenal. And the one thing about Ari is that he didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to be Mr. Productivity. It was really out of survival to some degree, and he ended up overcoming Crohn's. And I don't want to steal his thunder, but he has an incredible story, and his system is it's a really interesting system. He's going to go through the entire system here on the stage, but I've dabbled a lot with productivity experts, and his system really resonates with me the most, and a lot of people in our community. So incredibly excited to have him. Ladies and gentlemen, hold on, that's his family, Ari Meisel.
Tucker's up next, and he asked me not to set the bar too high, so I'm just going to take off my clothes and try to do a handstand. That's okay. Jason, thank you for having me here, and thank you all for being here. I have my own event, my first time I'm putting on this weekend. And Jason emailed me a couple months ago, and he's like, so I guess you're not coming to the event. I wrote back and I said, why? He's like, well, you got your event right after. I said, oh, okay, just put me on the first day. So I'm leaving tonight, and I'm so happy that I could be here with you all. What I love about this event, I've only been here, this is the second time, of course, is I feel like a lot of times I give presentations, but this is where I get to give a talk, and I'm really excited about it. So, most productive man alive. You know, the problem with productivity is that I think there tends to be kind of a geeky, nerdy, techie kind of association with it, and I love technology, and Nir and I have a lot to talk about, actually, and I agree with everything that he said. Technology will amplify your current habits. So if you have good habits, it will make them better, and if you have bad habits, it's going to make them a lot worse, because everybody knows that person who has thousands of emails, and they're like, oh, I'm just going to install these 3 plugins, and it's going to be great. It doesn't quite work that way. So what I want to share with you today is why productivity is important to me, and what drives me to be productive, and it has nothing to do with technology. So I'm going to share some stuff that I've never shared in any other forum. So yeah, so I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease 8 years ago now, I think. It was 8 years ago. I was 23 years old, or 24, and I had just accumulated $3 million of debt after doing a construction project in upstate New York. And I was not particularly healthy. I was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. I was eating McDonald's at least twice a day. The McGriddle had just come out. It was amazing. And and I wasn't taking very good care of my body, my mind, my soul, anything. And I found that in life, in my life at least, there's these peaks and troughs. And what I do now is I help the overwhelmed become more effective. That's what I love to do. And it's not so much good or bad that I find causes stress, it's the change usually. Because you really can kind of get used to almost anything. And it's really that shifting that causes a lot of the stress and a lot of the distress. And even within a bad situation that gets worse and then a little bit better and worse, or a good situation that moves around, that change is really kind of what messes with us. And as Joe said, you know, the body wants to be comfortable. It wants to stick to this homeostasis. So we try to avoid those changes as much as we can. So I was diagnosed with Crohn's at 24. I got a voicemail from the first doctor that diagnosed me, and he said, it went like this. Hi, Ari, it's Dr. Perlman. We got your test results back. You are positive for Crohn's disease. You're going to have to start taking these 8 different medicines. The scripts are with my receptionist. You can get them tomorrow. That was a voicemail. So I went to Google, of course, and I started seeing all these things. The only thing I knew about Crohn's at that point was that the drummer of Pearl Jam has it really bad. So the information out there about Crohn's is pretty bad. It's an incurable disease. It's impossible to cure Crohn's. I love impossible. So I was pretty optimistic, actually, at first. And then I went to the doctor. I went to another doctor, actually, who didn't diagnose me by voicemail. And he had a little bit better approach. We started with one medicine. But very quickly that became 2 and 3 and 4, and I was taking 16 pills a day, and I was getting blood tests every 5 weeks, and I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I was about 45 pounds heavier than I am now, and that wasn't because I was fat, that was because I was inflamed beyond all belief, and completely bloated, and just in a horrible situation. I was getting sicker. And the medicines were not really helping, they were kind of making it worse. And the last medicine the most powerful medicine I was put on was called mercaptopurine, which is a leukemia drug from 40 years ago, that started to actually help a little bit. But I had morning sickness for 6 months. We would walk down the street and I'd have to stop and just throw up in like a doorway. And all sorts of bad things were going on. So in the midst of this, I'm in the hospital a bunch, all sorts of fun things were happening. I was getting test after test after test, blood tests, MRIs, CAT scans, all sorts of things. Oddly enough, the most upsetting test I ever had done was a sonogram. And anybody who's had a sonogram knows it's really not a big deal. It's like the least invasive thing. I'd had so many people stick their hands inside me at that point. Like, a sonogram was really not a big deal, but I was in the room by myself on my side. It was just a technician. It wasn't my doctor who was doing it. And I started to cry. I just felt like that. It was the first time I felt like I was broken. So, fortunately, I started to turn things around, and the 6MP was actually starting to give me a little bit of relief. And I'm driving to upstate New York one day, and that was where I was doing this real estate development, which is a 3.5-hour drive. And for some reason, something like clicked in my mind, and I remembered that one of the big risks of 6MP was a 10,000-fold increased risk for lymphoma. Now, don't worry, I didn't get lymphoma. But for some reason that clicked in my head, and my grandmother died of lymphoma when I was a year old. So I don't know what it was, I had some like mental clarity, and I was like, oh, lymphoma, okay. So I called my father, which was a bad idea, and I said, I just wanted to ask you, like, where was grandma's lymphoma? And he's like, I don't know. He's like, call Elliot. Elliot's my uncle. So I call Elliot, and I ask him without hesitation, he says, oh, it was at the terminal ileum. I dropped the phone while I'm driving. So terminal ileum is where the large intestines meet the small intestines, which is exactly where my Crohn's is sort of centered, or was centered. So I hit a patch of ice, flipped the truck over that I was driving. This was on Route 380. I flipped my truck, and 45 minutes later or so, the state trooper showed up and asked me if I could drive away. And I said, if you help me flip my truck over, sure, I'll try. So I was just a mess. I was a real mess. And so shortly thereafter, I had a really bad bout where I went to the hospital again. And I got through the night, and this was the turning point. So I thought that I was going to die. I wasn't probably going to die, but I felt like that. It was probably the closest I ever came to having surgery for Crohn's. And I made it through the night, spiked 105-degree fever for some unknown reason, went completely delirious. And then that was like the next day where I was like, okay, I have to do something different. And then a lot of you may have heard the story already, so I'll just be quick. But basically, I spent the next 4 or 5 months experimenting on myself, tracking everything I could, and I got off my meds after about 5 months. And 2 months after that, I competed in my first triathlon. So, good. Peaks and valleys, right? Or valleys and peaks, I guess. So then I set my sights on Ironman France. I start training for Ironman France. I'm starting to get in much better shape. I'm doing well, but I'm not thriving, in my opinion. Middle of the summer, my mother-in-law, who I was very close to, called me and said, I need you to come over to talk to me. Okay. So I came over, and she says, I have cancer again. She hadn't seen a doctor at this point, but she's the kind of woman who, if she said something like that, she was right. And she was right. She had mesothelioma. So I'm training for Ironman. She starts to get sicker. And I was an EMT at that point. Through this process, I became an EMT. And we moved her into our home, and I became her primary caregiver. Because I was an EMT, they were allowing me to do a lot of things that they would have otherwise had to have nurses come in and do or be in the hospital for. But that's a very intense place to be. Plus, I'm training 25 hours a week for Ironman at that point because I hadn't met Ben. I didn't know how to do it in 8 hours. And so I literally would get up at 4 in the morning, be on my bike trainer in my office for 4 hours, and then come out and give her a shot. And And she kept withering, getting sicker and sicker, and I was the person that put the stethoscope on her chest to determine that she was dead. My wife had really, really wanted to get pregnant before her mother died so she could see her pregnant, and that didn't happen. 2 months later, we're in New Orleans for the half Ironman that I was going to run there, and that night we conceived our first child. Against my will, by the way. I was like, no, I've got my event tomorrow, I can't do this, and she insisted, and she was right. Apparently biking that many hours does not affect sperm production. So, okay, so she's pregnant, that's good, but there's obviously a lot of mixed emotions there. Her mother died on Valentine's Day in our home. 2 months later, she's pregnant. And in all my testing and tracking, I'd done 23andMe, and I found that Anna, my wife, she was a carrier for cystic fibrosis. I was not. So she's pregnant. I think 3 months or so into the pregnancy, we switched doctors because pregnant women are completely rational at all times. And she decided to switch doctors midstream, and the doctor wants us to get retested. Find out that I am a carrier for cystic fibrosis. And 23andMe doesn't test for all strains. So that's really fucking scary. Cystic fibrosis is a horrible, horrible disease, and most kids, even nowadays, don't live to their teens. So this is about 4 months into the pregnancy, we find out that we can test for this at some point, but there's risks with the testing, and why test unless you're going to do something about it? And there were a couple family members of ours who suggested that we should terminate the pregnancy. And we didn't, obviously, and we didn't test either. And Ben was born. It was a healthy pregnancy. My son Ben was born, and it took about 2 months to complete all the testing necessary, and he turned out to not be even a carrier of cystic fibrosis. We got the 1 in 4 chance that wasn't the case. So we decided we don't want that to happen again. We want more kids. So we begin at 6 months. She stops breastfeeding, and we start the process of IVF. And I'm giving my wife shots in her mass every day, which was not that bad for me. And so there's a whole emotional kind of roller coaster in our life. And by the way, this is while I'm building Less Doing the entire time. I'm building a company out of a hobby blog, essentially, where I'm going to tell people how to be more productive. I hadn't quite figured out how big of an impact stress had on my life, actually, and what led to eventually creating the system to help people stress less or manage their stress better. So we do IVF. We are able to screen out for cystic fibrosis. All the statistics for IVF are based on people who are infertile, which we are obviously not. So they're like, oh yeah, you should definitely put 2 eggs in because better chance. We put 2 eggs in, we got twins. It's wonderful, though, of course. So our kids are 14 months apart, which is basically like having triplets. They're 3 crazy boys. And I am completely overcompensating for a lack of a relationship with my father by trying to be the most amazing father that I can be. I don't know if I'm doing that, but I'm trying. And so Ben has his first word at 18 months, or roughly there, and it was, oh no, because he saw dog poop, and he said, oh no. And he had a couple more, and then about 2 months into that, they stopped. His words stopped, and he started to decline very quickly and stopped responding to his name and started getting very aggressive, and we started to think that maybe he was autistic. And we went to doctors, a couple doctors, and it turned out that he had fluid in his ears. So he was actually partially deaf from that. And it was a really critical time, obviously, for speech development. So the doctor was like, well, you can try this nose spray for a month, but it's probably going to have to do surgery and do tubes. And I stupidly asked him, I said, well, is there anything we can do diet-wise? He said, no, that doesn't help. Got home that day, and we switched Ben's diet up quite a bit. And a month later, came back to the doctor, and his ears were clear, and he could hear. And has been in speech therapy since then, and he's doing much better. But I got really tired of hearing people tell me something was wrong with my son. So, what does all this have to do with productivity? Everything. Productivity could be how you handle your email, and that certainly is something that I deal with. It could be how you schedule things with the virtual assistants you hire. But the truth is, why do we want to be more productive? Why do we care? What drives us to have that time, to use that time? So what I always say to people, look, this is the methodology that I've created. It's to optimize, automate, and outsource everything in your life, including your health. And it's very important. I want to run you through that very, very quickly. Don't outsource first, ever, please, because that makes the problem worse in a lot of cases. Optimize first, which means look at what the problem is. What causes stress and overwhelm is because you don't know what's causing it. It's so many, as Nir said, there's all these inputs, the information, all this stuff is happening. You can't keep up with that. So you need to optimize, which means tracking, identifying the things that are going on in your life, identifying the processes that you go through on a regular basis, and trying to make those more efficient on themselves. The second part is to automate, and as Salim said, technology is changing so fast that we can automate things that you couldn't automate 3 months ago. Things that a human had to do 3 months ago, computers can do now. Free apps can do. So automating second. And if there's anything left over, that's when you look at outsourcing it to a specialist or a generalist, like a virtual assistant, like a graphic designer, anything like that. But you have to go through this process and that applies to everything, your business, your life, your health, your family, all this stuff. The next thing is that, and this is not my opinion, this is research-based, you need to offload 70% of everything you do every year if you want to have any chance of growing as a person or as a business. This is a fact, okay? You have to offload 70% of everything you do. And I promise you that that number is actually more like 95%. 5% of the things that any of you in this room do, including me, is your unique ability and what you should be able to focus on all your time, or as much of the time as you can. 95% of the stuff you do can be done by other people or other things. And you need to get in that mindset. This is a mindset shift that needs to take place. And then another thing is the concept of peak time. Okay, so everybody has a peak time throughout the day, and some of you may actually know what it is, but for most people, it's usually in the morning. My peak time is usually between 10 and noon. For most people, it's about 90 minutes. So try to think about that if you can. Your peak time, and again, this is not my opinion, this is research-based, your peak time is 2 to 100 times more productive and effective than any of the other time in the day. And yes, that does mean that you could literally work for 90 minutes a day and probably get a lot more done than you could if you didn't work the rest of the day. I'm not saying you have to do that, but protect your prime time, your peak time. And as much as you can, respect the prime time of others. If you have an organization, if you have a spouse, if you have any relationship with anybody, try not to ask them to do things that are not in their core ability outside of their prime time. And they should respect yours as well. And I promise you, you're going to see some incredible results. Richard Branson is famous for like working 45 minutes a day. You know, and you can set these kinds of limits on yourself, by the way. Neil Strauss, who's the author, who's one of my favorite authors, he's on the internet for 2 individual hours a day. That's it. His girlfriend has the password, he has no choice. 2 hours a day. But John Paul Giorgio, who's a multi-billionaire, owns Paul Mitchell and stuff, has never had an email address. It's your choice. So you can set these limits and you can respect that time of yourself. But the main point is just that you need to know what drives you to be more productive. Productivity is a symptom, basically. And you need to figure out what that cause is for yourself. And then again, remember to optimize, automate, and outsource everything that you do. And shift your mindset so that you can do the impossible. And on that last note, there was a musician, a jazz musician in the 30s named Art Tatum. Has anyone ever heard of Art Tatum? Okay, so this is just a wonderful story about impossibility. He was a little boy, he was born partially blind, he was beat up by some kids when he was young, so he was pretty much completely blind, and his parents allowed him to go to this honky-tonk bar, and they would basically push him up to the player piano and let him sit and touch the piano and feel the keys that were moving, which is how he learned to play the piano. And I really recommend anybody who go to YouTube and look up an Art Tatum piece and listen to him play. What he didn't realize, because nobody told him, was that player pianos were created with 2 people playing, so 20 fingers. So he was playing 20 fingers with 10, which is impossible, but nobody told him that that was the case. So it's a really incredible thing to hear. So, impossible is a stupid word. Thank you.